Well, so much at stake. I mean, we're only talking about the greatest prophetic fulfillment in the last 2,000 years. That's what's at stake here. It seems like things were humming right along until last week. It came time for the release of another 26 prisoners by Israel. By this time, the word was out that the Palestinians were only negotiating to secure the release of the prisoners, and that they were not going to continue to negotiate beyond April the 29th, that they were just waiting to get their prisoners released. Then they were going to go to the United Nations and unilaterally appeal for recognition of a Palestinian state, bypassing the negotiations. Consequently, Israel said, wait a minute. Why should we release prisoners if that's all that's going to happen? Why should you get that benefit? So they stalled. There were negotiations continuing that would have extended the peace negotiations for another 9 months into 2015. Supposedly 400 more prisoners, the ones without blood on their hands, would be released. And there was also a wild card in the mix. The arrested Israeli spy, Jonathan Pollard, that's now been serving over 25 years in prison, would be released to the nation of Israel as part of the deal. Well, all of that came unraveled because when Israel decided to stall 3 or 4 days until they could get this new deal in place, Abbas surprised everyone by joining 15 international organizations. The deal was that during the negotiations, the Palestinians would not appeal to the international community. They would stick with the negotiations, and Israel would release the prisoners. So technically, Israel violated their side of the deal for 3 or 4 days. Livni said, but they knew that we were negotiating a much bigger deal and that we were going to be releasing those prisoners. They just simply jumped at the chance for the slightest infraction so that they then could do what they wanted to do. Well, all of this is ricocheting around like a wild bullet around the Middle East. Everybody wondering who it will hit. And everybody's saying, okay, are the negotiations over? John Kerry has invested so much back and forth. He spent nearly all of his time dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and now then Kerry says, I have to reappraise if I'm wasting my time. If the two sides are unwilling to take the necessary decisions to actually put a deal together, then I might as well go work on something else. The Ukraine is boiling. The Iranian situation has to be dealt with. There are developments in the Pacific that need my attention. And so now everybody's wondering, will President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry pull out of the situation and leave the Palestinians and the Israelis to their own devices? Well, it remains to be seen. It's obvious that President Obama desperately wants to get a deal in the Middle East. He has worked on it more than any other U.S. president. He believes that getting a deal there could be the key to getting a deal everywhere. Well, that's where things stand right now. It looks like the whole thing was coming apart. However, the representative for the Palestinians and the Israelis met yesterday for many hours into the wee hours of the morning. They're back at it again today. We haven't got the reports from today's meeting. They said concerning yesterday's meeting that the meetings were serious and the meetings were tense. Now, so where is this going? What's really going on behind closed doors? It's hard for us to know because John Kerry has sworn all sides to secrecy. Don't be given press conferences after every meeting, airing all the disputes, because once you get the world talking about something, then issues take on a dynamic of their own. So the best thing we can do is to contain these things until we get to where we need to go. Now, the big question is, though, where do we need to go? Now, here's where the Palestinians say the talks need to go. A Palestinian state established within pre-1967 borders of the West Bank, that East Jerusalem should be the capital of the Palestinians, and that refugees should have the right of return to their homes, those that have been expelled over the years through war. Now, the Israelis say, we will not return to 67 borders. Those are not defensible borders. But we have to have borders that will ensure the security of our nation. If we can't get that, then we simply do not have a deal. Next, the Palestinians need to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. We have to have our own Jewish state. The Jews have been wandering for 2,000 years, not having a place of their own, not having a place where they could feel safe, and they don't want to go back to that ever again. So we must have a Jewish state. And then also, we are not going to redivide Jerusalem. It is our eternal, undivided capital, and we are not going to redivide it. So those are the big issues that are separating the two sides. How do you get those things together? Abbas says there's no peace without a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, and Netanyahu says we're not giving up East Jerusalem. What do you do with that? The borders, they seem to be a little bit more doable because the Palestinians have said, yes, we will accept land swaps. We know that you have population centers that it's impossible to move over in the 67 territory. Therefore, we will concede you can keep that if you give us an equal amount of acreage somewhere else so that we can say we got 100% back, and on the story goes. Now, if there's going to be a deal, then those issues have to be resolved. I think one of the interesting questions is, what if there is no deal? What happens then? Things drag on. Will there be a new intifada? Will there be a Middle East war? What actually takes place? What happens? Does Israel unilaterally annex Section 3? Does Israel simply lay claim to all of the promised land as it's described in the Bible? There's a lot of ideas floating out there. So what happens? Now, Abbas says he's going to the United Nations. He's going to press charges against Israel at the International Criminal Court because the International Criminal Court statute says that it's a war crime to take territory and then to transfer your population into that territory. He said that's what you've done. Israel said no. That was nobody's territory. That was disputed territory. You call it occupied territory, but you never had a state there. This was the Palestinian territories that Israel and the Arabs shared for many years. And then when the state of Israel was founded as a result of a UN resolution, you attacked us and tried to destroy us, and the borders have now been determined by war ever since, and you started the wars. And you're not willing to accept the consequences of your own actions. You started the war and you don't like the result. Now then you're trying to say we're war criminals because you started a war against us. And on the argument goes. Now, those are the kinds of wranglings that have been going on for the last 8 months behind closed doors. We have 22 days left until the deadline. The deadline was set back on July the 30th of 2013. And John Kerry said, we will have a deal by April the 29th of 2014. So that's what's going on. That's the back and forth. In the meantime, there are other things that are lurking in the shadows as well. But I want to make sure that we all appreciate the magnitude of what we're dealing with here. We're talking about if a deal is obtained over the next 22 days between Palestinians and Israelis, even if they don't solve all the issues. Matter of fact, the prophecies of the Bible seem to indicate it will be an interim deal, that there will be some issues solved, some issues will not be solved. They will be put off till later, perhaps 7 years later. If they get even an interim deal that does three things. Number one, it does establish a Palestinian state in what's known as Judea. Most commonly, you and I would refer to it as the West Bank. So it establishes a Palestinian state. What does it do about the Jews living there right now? It will allow them to stay there as a Jewish minority under the new Palestinian government if they so choose. Number three, the Temple Mount will be placed under a sharing arrangement, opening the door for building Israel's third temple without disturbing the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The sharing of the Temple Mount will be placed under international supervision. If those three things happen, one more time, if a Palestinian state is established in the area called Biblical Judea or the West Bank, if Jews presently living there are allowed to stay there as a Jewish minority under the Palestinian government, and if the Temple Mount is placed under a sharing arrangement so that both Jew and Muslim can worship there, if those three things happen, according to my understanding of Bible prophecy, this will trigger the final 7 years to Armageddon. Now, could they get there from here? Yes, they could, if Abbas is willing to put off the Jerusalem issue, if they can postpone dealing with the Jerusalem issue. So could we even see that happen within the next 22 days? It is possible that it could happen within the next 22 days because Israel does not want to be brought before the world community and have the United Nations levying sanctions against her and ultimately maybe even threatening military invasion. Now, we know this is going to happen because the UN invades Israel at the Battle of Armageddon, but it's not due to happen now. We're talking about 7 years after the peace agreement is struck. So that's what's hanging in the balance right now. Will they get at least an interim deal in the next 22 days? Will they not? We'll talk more about it when we get back. You're listening to Politics and Religion, and this is prophecy being fulfilled in front of our very eyes. Stay with us.